Claire sat at her workstation, her face set in a permanent scowl as she watched Dr. Andre Williams enter the hospital. He was clearly in pain, but Claire couldn't care less. "Another one looking for attention," she muttered under her breath. As Andre approached her desk, Claire barely looked up from her computer screen. "Excuse me, I'm experiencing persistent pain," and Andre began, but Claire cut him off. "Fill out these forms and wait your turn," she snapped, shoving a clipboard towards him. "We're busy here." Andre tried again to explain his symptoms, but Claire's dismissive attitude made it clear she wasn't interested. He watched as she interacted with other patients, noting the stark difference in her demeanor. To some, she was almost motherly, while to others, particularly those from marginalized groups, she was cold and indifferent. As the day progressed, Andre observed Claire's behavior more closely. He felt a growing sense of frustration and helplessness, but something inside him hardened. He decided he wouldn't let this treatment go unchallenged. Later that afternoon, a young woman named Lisa rushed into the ER, cradling her feverish daughter. "Please, my daughter's been running a high fever for days," Lisa pleaded, her voice trembling with worry. Claire glanced up, her eyes scanning Lisa's worn clothes and unkempt appearance. Without a word, she pushed a form across the counter. "Fill this out and wait your turn," she said, her tone devoid of empathy. Lisa's frustration mounted as she watched Claire cheerfully greet a well-dressed couple who had just entered. The contrast in treatment was glaring, and Lisa felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of anger and shame. Andre, still waiting, caught Lisa's eye and gave her a sympathetic nod. He could see the tears forming in her eyes as she clutched her daughter closer. The injustice of the situation was palpable, and Andre felt his resolve strengthen. Something had to change, and he was determined to be part of that change. During a quiet moment, Andre found himself in conversation with Dr. David Chun, a colleague he'd known for years. They stood in a corner of the cafeteria, voices low. "Look, Andre," David said, leaning in, "I've been here for a while. This place, it's resistant to change, especially when it comes to diversity." Andre nodded, his brow furrowed. "I've noticed it's more than just resistance, though. It's outright hostility in some cases." David sighed. "You're not wrong. Some staff, like Claire, they've been here forever. They're set in their ways, and they've created this toxic culture. It's not just about race either. It's about class, gender, you name it." As they spoke, Claire and a group of her colleagues entered the cafeteria. They huddled around a table, laughing loudly. Andre couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation. "Did you see that guy earlier?" Claire said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Thinks he's so smart just because he's a doctor. Probably got in on some diversity quota." The group erupted in laughter, oblivious to the discomfort of other staff members nearby. Andre felt his jaw clench, but before he could react, his pager went off. "Dr. Williams, please report to the administrator's office immediately," the message read. Confused, Andre made his way to the top floor. As he entered the office, he was greeted by the hospital's board of directors. "Dr. Williams," the chief administrator began, "we've been observing your work, and we're impressed. We'd like to offer you the position of medical director." Andre stood in stunned silence. A mix of emotions washed over him: pride, nervousness, determination. He realized this was his chance to make real change. I'm honored," he finally managed to say, "and I accept." As the board members congratulated him, Andre's mind raced. He knew the challenges ahead would be immense, but he was ready to face them head-on. This was his opportunity to address the systemic issues he'd witnessed, to create a more equitable and compassionate healthcare environment for all patients and staff. The conference room buzzed with tension as Andre stood at the head of the table, facing his first staff meeting as medical director. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before addressing the room. "Good morning, everyone," Andre began, his voice firm but calm. "As your new medical director, I want to share my vision for our hospital. Our primary focus must be on providing exceptional care to all patients, regardless of their background. This means cultivating an environment of empathy, respect, and inclusivity." He paused, noting the mixed reactions around the room. Some nodded in agreement, while others, like Claire, wore expressions of barely concealed disdain. We'll be implementing new training programs and protocols to ensure equal treatment for all patients, Andre continued. Our goal is to become a model of compassionate, unbiased healthcare. Before he could elaborate further, Claire's voice cut through the room. With all due respect, Dr. Williams, she said, her tone anything but respectful. We have standards here. Standards that have worked for years. Are you suggesting we lower those standards for the sake of diversity? The room fell silent, all eyes darting between Claire and Andre. Andre met her gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. On the contrary, Nurse Claire, he replied calmly. I'm suggesting we raise our standards. True excellence in healthcare means treating every patient with dignity and providing top-quality care to all. That's not lowering standards. It's fulfilling our oath as medical professionals. Claire scoffed, but before she could retort, Dr. Chen spoke up. I think Dr. Williams is right, he said, his voice gaining strength as he continued. I've had concerns about our culture for a while now. We can do better. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Other staff members began to voice their own concerns and experiences, sharing stories of patients who had been mistreated or overlooked. As the discussion grew more animated, the tension in the room shifted. Many staff members seemed energized by the prospect of positive change, while others, like Claire and her close associates, grew increasingly defensive. Andre observed the dynamics carefully, recognizing both the challenges and opportunities ahead. This meeting was just the beginning of what promised to be a long and difficult journey towards transforming the hospital's culture. In the weeks following the staff meeting, Andre set about implementing his vision for change. He organized a series of mandatory workshops on diversity and inclusion, designed to educate staff and foster a more empathetic environment. As the first workshop was about to begin, Andre noticed Claire's conspicuous absence. He found her at the nurse's station, deliberately ignoring the announcement over the PA system. Nurse Claire, Andre approached her, keeping his tone professional. The workshop is starting. Your participation is required. Claire barely looked up from her paperwork. I have patients to attend to, Dr. Williams. I don't need sensitivity training to do my job. Andre was about to respond when a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. It was Lisa, the single mother he had observed earlier, now back with her daughter, who looked even more ill than before. Please, Lisa begged, her voice cracking. My daughter's fever hasn't broken. She's getting worse. Claire glanced at them dismissively. Take a number and wait your turn, she said coldly, turning back to her paperwork. Lisa's face crumpled in despair. But we've been here before, and you sent us home. Please, she needs help now. Andre stepped in immediately. I'll take a look at her right away, he said, guiding Lisa and her daughter to an examination room. As they walked away, he caught Claire's eye. We'll discuss your workshop attendance later, he said firmly. In the exam room, Andre quickly assessed the child's condition. She's severely dehydrated, he muttered, immediately calling for 4 fluids and additional tests. As they waited for the results, Andre spoke softly to Lisa. I'm sorry for your experience here. It's not acceptable, and I want you to know we're working to change things. Lisa nodded, tears in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. I felt so helpless, like no one cared. Andre placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I care, he said, and I promise you things will improve. Your daughter will receive the best care possible, and I'll personally oversee her treatment. As he left the room to check on the test results, Andre's resolve strengthened. The incident with Lisa and her daughter only underscored the urgent need for change in the hospital's culture. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but moments like these reminded him why the fight was so crucial. The diversity workshops were in full swing, with Andre leading the charge. Today's session focused on personal experiences, and Andre decided to share his own story. I grew up in a neighborhood where access to healthcare was limited, Andre began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. As a black man pursuing a career in medicine, I faced countless obstacles and prejudices. There were times when patients refused to be treated by me, assuming I was less qualified than my white colleagues. The room was silent, with many staff members visibly moved by Andre's candor. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Claire lingering by the door, listening but refusing to enter. These experiences didn't discourage me, Andre continued. Instead, they fueled my determination to create change from within the system. I'm sharing this because I want you to understand that our biases, conscious or unconscious, have real impacts on people's lives. As Andre finished speaking, Tom, a middle-aged veteran who worked in the hospital's administration, raised his hand. "Dr. Williams, if I may," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "I've never shared this before, but your story resonates with me." Tom went on to describe his own experiences of discrimination within the hospital. As a veteran with PTSD, he had often been dismissed or treated with suspicion by medical staff. "I've been made to feel like a drug seeker when I was in genuine pain," Tom said, his eyes glistening. "It's humiliating, and it's made me reluctant to seek care when I need it." The room was thick with emotion as Tom finished speaking. Several staff members wiped away tears, while others nodded in understanding. The personal stories had struck a chord, making the issue of discrimination feel immediate and real. As the session concluded, there was a palpable shift in the room. Many staff members approached Andre, Tom, and others who had shared their experiences, expressing gratitude and a newfound commitment to change. Claire, however, remained apart from the group. She had listened to the entire session from the doorway, her expression unreadable. As people filed out, Andre caught her eye, hoping to see some sign of understanding or empathy. But Claire quickly looked away, her posture rigid as she hurried back to her station. Despite Claire's continued resistance, Andre felt a glimmer of hope. The workshops were having an impact, slowly but surely changing hearts and minds. The path to transforming the hospital's culture was long, but moments like these showed that progress was possible. Andre decided it was time to confront Claire directly. He scheduled a private meeting with her, determined to address her behavior and its impact on the hospital environment. As Claire entered his office, her face was set in a defensive scowl. "You wanted to see me, Dr. Williams?" she said, her tone barely civil. Andre gestured for her to sit. "Yes, Claire. We need to discuss your recent conduct and your resistance to our new initiatives." Claire's posture stiffened. "My conduct? I've been doing my job the same way for 20 years. It's not my fault if some people can't handle it." Andre leaned forward, his voice firm but calm. "That's precisely the problem, Claire. The way you've been doing your job is harmful. You've consistently shown bias against certain patients and staff members." "I treat everyone the same," Claire protested, her voice rising. "I don't coddle anyone. That's not discrimination. That's fairness." Andre shook his head. "Fairness isn't about treating everyone identically, Claire. It's about recognizing and addressing individual needs and challenges. Your actions have made many patients feel unwelcome and unsupported." He proceeded to outline specific incidents, including her treatment of Lisa and her daughter. Claire's face flushed as Andre spoke, a mix of anger and discomfort evident in her expression. "I want you to consider something," Andre said, his tone softening slightly. "Imagine if you or a loved one were in a vulnerable position, seeking help, and were treated with the dismissiveness you've shown to others. How would that feel?" For a moment, Claire's defensive facade cracked. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. I'm just doing my job," she said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Andre pressed on. "Your job is to provide care and support to all patients, Claire, not just the ones you deem worthy. I'm asking you to open your mind, to consider a different perspective." Claire sat in silence for a long moment, her internal struggle visible. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can change. This is who I've always been." Andre nodded, understanding the difficulty of self-reflection. "Change isn't easy, Claire, but it's necessary. I'm not asking you to transform overnight. I'm asking you to try, to be open to learning and growing." As Claire left the office, her usual confident stride was absent. She moved slowly, lost in thought. Andre watched her go, hoping that this conversation had planted a seed of change, however small. The hospital auditorium was packed for Andre's presentation on healthcare disparities. As he stood at the podium, surrounded by charts and graphs, the tension in the room was palpable. "What I'm about to show you may be difficult to process," Andre began, his voice steady. But it's crucial information that we, as healthcare providers, must confront. He clicked to the first slide, displaying stark statistics on treatment outcomes across different racial and socioeconomic groups. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience as the data appeared on screen. These numbers represent real people, real lives, Andre continued. Patients who received substandard care due to bias, whether conscious or unconscious. As he delved deeper into the statistics, showing how certain groups consistently received less pain medication, shorter consultation times, and delayed diagnoses, the shock in the room was evident. Many staff members looked visibly uncomfortable, while others appeared angry or defensive. In the back of the room, Claire sat rigid in her chair. Her face paled as she recognized patterns in the data that mirrored her own behavior. She glanced around, noticing how her colleagues were distancing themselves from her, both physically and emotionally. As the presentation concluded, Andre opened the floor for questions. The discussion that followed was heated, with some staff members expressing disbelief, while others shared their own observations that supported the data. Amidst the debate, Lisa, the single mother Andre had helped earlier, stood up. "I want to thank Dr. Williams for this presentation," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "As someone who has experienced this discrimination firsthand, I can attest to its reality and its impact." Her words seemed to galvanize others. More patients in the audience began to speak up, sharing their own stories of feeling marginalized or ignored within the healthcare system. Claire, feeling increasingly isolated, slipped out of the auditorium before the session ended. The weight of her actions, now quantified in stark data and supported by personal testimonies, was becoming impossible to ignore. As the meeting dispersed, Andre noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Many staff members approached him, expressing their commitment to change and asking how they could improve their practice. The data had made the abstract concept of healthcare inequality concrete, spurring a desire for action. Andre felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. The presentation had been challenging, but it had also been a turning point. The hospital staff could no longer deny the reality of the problem. Now, the real work of implementing systemic changes could begin. The hospital's main atrium was transformed for the community inclusion event. Chairs were arranged in a large circle, with Andre standing at the center, ready to facilitate the sharing of stories. "Welcome, everyone," Andre began, his voice warm and inviting. "Today, we're here to listen and learn from each other. Every story matters. Every experience counts." One by one, patients and staff members began to share their experiences. An elderly man recounted feeling dismissed due to his age. A transgender woman described the anxiety she felt every time she needed medical care. A nurse of color shared instances of microaggressions she'd faced from colleagues. Claire sat at the edge of the circle, visibly uncomfortable. She had been required to attend, but her body language screamed reluctance. As the stories unfolded, however, something in her demeanor began to shift. A young boy in a wheelchair spoke about how a nurse's kindness had made a difficult procedure bearable. Claire's eyes widened in recognition. It was a patient she had cared for last month. She hadn't realized the impact of her actions that day. As more people shared, Claire found herself listening intently. The raw emotion in their voices, the vulnerability in their stories. It was impossible to remain detached. Towards the end of the event, Andre took center stage again. His voice was thick with emotion as he began to speak. "Every day, we have the power to impact lives," he said. "Our actions, our words, they can heal or harm. They can make a patient feel seen and valued, or invisible and worthless." He paused, looking around the room. "We entered this profession to help people, but helping isn't just about medical procedures. It's about compassion, empathy, and respect. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person who walks through our doors." As Andre spoke, many in the audience were moved to tears. Even Claire found herself blinking rapidly, trying to hide the moisture in her eyes. "Today, we've heard powerful stories of both pain and hope," Andre continued. "Let these stories guide us. Let them remind us why we do what we do and how we can do it better." The event concluded with a standing ovation. As people began to disperse, There was a buzz of conversation, with many expressing how the stories had opened their eyes. Claire remained in her seat, lost in thought. For the first time, she was truly grappling with the impact of her actions. The faces and stories of those she had dismissed or treated poorly flashed through her mind. She felt a weight settling in her chest, a mix of guilt and the dawning realization that change was not just necessary, but urgent. In the weeks following the community event, the hospital saw a wave of changes. New protocols were implemented, focusing on patient-centered care and cultural sensitivity. The medical staff, inspired by the stories they'd heard, embraced these changes with enthusiasm. Claire, however, struggled to adapt. She found herself second-guessing her interactions with patients, acutely aware of her past behaviors. Her usual confident demeanor had given way to hesitation and uncertainty. One morning, as Claire was checking inventory in the supply closet, Dr. Chen approached her. His face was serious, his tone measured. "Claire, we need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. "Your attitude lately, it's affecting the whole team." Claire bristled. "What are you talking about? I'm doing my job." Dr. Chen shook his head. "You're going through the motions, Claire. But your resistance to these changes is obvious. People notice. They're losing respect for you." His words hit Claire like a physical blow. She'd always prided herself on her reputation, on being seen as competent and in control. "I've worked here for decades," Claire said, her voice wavering. "I've always been respected. Times change, Claire," Dr. Chen replied gently. "And we need to change with them. The way you've treated certain patients, the comments you've made, it's not acceptable anymore." It never was. Claire felt a surge of defensiveness, but it quickly gave way to a deep-seated uncertainty. She realized that the ground beneath her feet had shifted, and she was struggling to find her footing in this new landscape. Meanwhile, Andre was preparing for a crucial meeting with the hospital administration. He'd spent weeks compiling data, gathering testimonials, and drafting a comprehensive policy on inclusivity and patient care. As he reviewed his notes one last time, Andre felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. This meeting could be a turning point for the hospital. He knew there would be resistance from some quarters, but he was determined to push for meaningful change. Andre took a deep breath, gathered his materials, and headed towards the boardroom. As he walked, he passed by the nurse's station where Claire sat, looking lost in thought. Their eyes met briefly, and Andre saw a flicker of something, uncertainty, perhaps even fear, in Claire's expression. He nodded to her politely before continuing on his way, realizing that the journey towards change was affecting everyone in different ways. The challenge ahead was not just about implementing new policies, but about guiding people through a fundamental shift in perspective and behavior. The boardroom was tense as Andre began his presentation on the new inclusivity policy. He had just started outlining the key points when Claire burst in, her face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, interrupting Andre mid-sentence. "We're a hospital, not a social experiment. These policies will compromise patient care." Andre maintained his composure, addressing Claire calmly. "Nurse Claire, please take a seat. We're discussing how to improve patient care for everyone." Claire scoffed, her voice rising. "Improve? You're forcing us to waste time on sensitivity training when we should be focusing on medical procedures." As Claire continued her tirade, her words became increasingly inflammatory. She made sweeping generalizations about certain patient groups, her prejudices on full display. The room fell silent, shocked by the blatant discrimination in her words. Andre watched Claire carefully, noting the growing discomfort among the board members. When she finally paused for breath, he spoke. "Thank you for your candid input, Nurse Claire," Andre said, his voice steady. "You've just demonstrated exactly why these changes are necessary." He turned to address the board. "What you've just witnessed is the kind of attitude that has been poisoning our hospital environment. It's this mindset that leads to substandard care for certain patients." Andre then revealed a series of documented incidents involving Claire, times when her biases had led to delayed treatment, incorrect diagnoses, and patient complaints. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. Claire's face paled as she realized the extent of the documentation against her. "You've been spying on me?" she sputtered. No, Claire, Andre replied firmly. We've been listening to our patients and staff. We've been paying attention to patterns of behavior that compromise our standard of care. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions grave. The chair of the board cleared his throat. Dr. Williams, please continue with your presentation. Nurse Claire, I think it's best if you leave now. We'll discuss your future with the hospital later. As Claire was escorted out, her shoulders slumped in defeat, Andre resumed his presentation. He outlined a comprehensive plan for cultural competency training, policy changes, and accountability measures. The board listened attentively, now fully aware of the urgency of the situation. By the end of the meeting, they had unanimously approved Andre's proposals. As Andre left the boardroom, he felt a mixture of relief and determination. The hospital was on the brink of significant change. Claire's outburst, while unfortunate, had only served to underscore the importance of his work. In the weeks that followed, Claire was dismissed from her position, and Andre's new policies were implemented across the hospital. The staff embraced the changes, creating a more inclusive and compassionate environment for all patients. Andre's leadership had transformed the hospital culture, setting a new standard for equitable healthcare. As he walked through the halls, observing the positive interactions between staff and patients of all backgrounds, he knew that while the journey wasn't over, they were on the right path.